My name is Daniel Hale. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside systems that reward visibility more than value. I live in Seattle. I work in a corporate environment where meetings are frequent, voices overlap, and certainty is often confused with competence. If you passed me in the hallway, you probably wouldn't remember me. That's not bitterness, it's just accuracy. People usually describe me as reliable, calm, low maintenance, someone who doesn't cause problems. I'm the one who stays late without announcing it, the one who fixes things quietly when something breaks, the one whose name appears in the acknowledgments, if it appears at all. I don't interrupt. I don't dominate rooms. I don't have confidence. And because of that, people make assumptions. They assume I don't mind being overlooked. They assume silence means agreement. They assume stillness means lack of ambition. They assume, incorrectly, that nothing is happening underneath. This story is not about revenge. It's not about exposure, humiliation, or dramatic payback. There are no shouting matches, no viral moments, no last-minute miracles. What happened unfolded slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. It's the story of how a role gets assigned to you without your consent, and how difficult it is to notice that assignment while you're busy being useful. It's about the subtle ways respect erodes long before anyone says something openly cruel. About how small dismissals, when repeated, don't feel like abuse, but they do change the shape of your life. For a long time, I believed staying calm was the same as staying in control. I believed that patience would eventually be rewarded. I believed that if I just kept my head down, things would correct themselves. I was wrong about some of that. But I wasn't wrong about everything. This is a story about silence, but not the kind people expect. Not silence as fear, not silence as weakness. This is about silence as a decision, silence as preparation, silence as a way of seeing clearly when others are too busy talking. Over the course of this story, you'll see how nothing dramatic happens until it does. Change doesn't arrive with a bang, but with a moment of stillness. Consequences can begin long before anyone realizes a choice has been made. And most importantly, this is a story for people who have been described as easy to work with, when what that really meant was easy to overlook. For those who've been told, directly or indirectly, to wait their turn, without being told when that turn would come. I'm telling this now not to rewrite the past, and not to claim moral superiority. I'm telling it because quiet people are often written out of their own stories. So before I go on, I want to ask you something gently, honestly. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that the version of you everyone relied on was the version they never planned to truly see? If you had asked my colleagues to describe me, they wouldn't struggle. That's the strange part. I was easy to define, just not in ways that made me visible. Daniel's solid, very dependable. He doesn't need much direction. He's good at supporting the team. Supporting. That word followed me everywhere. I was never described as driving anything, never as a leader. I existed in the background of other people's momentum, like a well-lit hallway you pass through without stopping, necessary, functional, forgettable. In meetings, I sat slightly off-center, not by accident, but by habit. I took notes while others spoke. When I raised a point, it was often after the energy had already moved on, and I learned quickly that timing mattered more than insight. So I adjusted. I waited. I shortened my sentences. I stopped raising points that required silence to land. Over time, people stopped looking to me when decisions were made, but they always looked to me when something needed fixing afterward. If a report didn't quite make sense, it landed on my desk. If a client had follow-up questions that no one wanted to answer, I was looped in. If a deadline was at risk, I was quietly asked if I could help stabilize things. And I did, not because I was trying to be indispensable, but because I believed that contribution would eventually translate into recognition. That someone, somewhere, was paying attention. They weren't. What they were doing was learning how much weight I could carry without complaint. In social moments, team lunches, casual conversations, I noticed how often people talked around me instead of to me. Not rudely, not deliberately, just habitually. Like I was furniture they trusted would stay where it was. When jokes were made at my expense, they were light enough to pass as humor. A comment about how I never complain, how I'm low drama, how I'm built for the long haul. Once, someone said, laughing, "Daniel would survive any corporate apocalypse." Everyone smiled. I smiled too. But something about that stuck with me. Because survival wasn't what I wanted to be known for. I wasn't invisible because I lacked ability. I was invisible because I made things easier for others. And ease has a way of erasing the person who provides it. I didn't correct people when they interrupted me. I didn't reclaim credit when my work was summarized by someone else. I told myself it wasn't worth the tension. Staying calm was more professional, that people noticed these things eventually. What I didn't realize was that every time I let myself be compressed into the role of support, that role became my shape. There's a particular loneliness in being trusted, but not consulted, relied upon, but not respected. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It hums quietly in the background, like a machine you've learned to ignore, until one day you notice how tired you are. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was reduced to a function, reduced to a safety net, reduced to the person you assume will adapt. And the most dangerous part, everyone believed I was comfortable there, including me. The first moment of disrespect didn't arrive as an insult. It was smaller than that, quiet enough that no one else noticed. Small enough that I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened at all. We were in a project review meeting, one of those long, procedural ones where the outcome is usually decided before anyone sits down. I had spent weeks refining a process that reduced errors we'd been quietly absorbing for years. Nothing revolutionary, just be careful, patient work. The kind that prevents problems instead of creating headlines. When my turn came, I explained it simply. No jargon, no theatrics. There was a pause. Then someone else, someone more confident, louder, less precise, rephrased my idea. Not intentionally, I think, just confidently enough that the room leaned toward him. Heads nodded, notes were taken. Our manager smiled and said, "That's a great insight." Not to me, to him. I remember the exact moment I felt it. Not anger, something colder, like a thin line had been drawn, and I had been placed on the wrong side of it. I waited. Surely someone would clarify. Surely credit would land where it belonged. It didn't. The meeting moved on. My contribution had been absorbed, renamed, and reassigned in under 30 seconds. Afterward, a colleague leaned over and said, casually, "Good catch in there. That was helpful." Helpful. Not important. Not strategic. Helpful in the way a tool is helpful. I nodded, I said, "Glad it worked." That was the moment. The first scratch. It didn't hurt enough to bleed. It didn't stop me from functioning, but it marked something. Over the next few days, I replayed it in my head, not obsessively, but quietly. I asked myself if I should have spoken up, if I should have corrected the record. Each time, I arrived at the same conclusion. It wasn't worth it. Making a fuss would have made me look insecure, defensive, difficult, so I let it go, but I didn't forget it. What stayed with me wasn't the stolen credit. It was how easy it had been, how no one questioned it, how natural it seemed for the room to accept that the idea belonged to the person who delivered it with the most certainty. That realization settled somewhere deep, because once you notice a pattern like that, you start seeing it everywhere. In follow-up emails, my name was omitted. In planning documents, my work appeared without attribution. In conversations where my role was summarized as supporting analysis, even when I had designed the framework. Each instance was minor on its own, easy to excuse, easy to rationalize. But scratches accumulate, and the dangerous thing about small scratches is that they teach people what they can get away with, while teaching you what you're expected to endure. I stayed quiet. I stayed composed. Outwardly, nothing changed. Internally, something had been recorded. After the first scratch, nothing dramatic happened. That's how normalization works. No confrontation followed. No apology arrived. No lesson was learned by anyone but me. The moment passed, folded neatly into the routine of work, and life continued exactly as before. Except, I had started adjusting. The next time something similar happened, I recognized it immediately. A decision I had warned against was later described as unexpected but unavoidable. A risk I had documented was reframed as new information. My notes became background material. My voice became optional. And each time, I told myself a version of the same story. This is just how teams work. Not everything needs a name attached. Results matter more than recognition. These explanations sounded reasonable, mature even. I prided myself on being the kind of person who didn't need validation to do good work. What I didn't see, at least not yet, was how often those explanations protected everyone except me. I began pre-editing myself in meetings. I'd test ideas silently before deciding whether they were worth the energy of saying aloud. If someone else was already speaking, I'd wait, even when I knew they were wrong, because correcting them would disrupt the flow. I became efficient at restraint. People liked that about me. "You're easy to work with," they said. "You don't have an ego. You're very flexible." Flexibility became my defining feature. Not adaptability, flexibility. The kind that bends to fit whatever shape is required. When new projects were assigned, I was often brought in late. Not at the decision stage, but at the repair stage. When something needed smoothing, clarifying, salvaging, I stopped expecting to be asked for my opinion early. That expectation had quietly died somewhere along the way. What surprised me most wasn't how others treated me, it was how quickly I adapted to it. I learned where my voice would be welcomed and where it would be ignored. I learned which battles weren't worth the cost. I learned how to disappear just enough to remain useful. And I told myself this was maturity. There's a comfort in normalization. It reduces friction. It keeps things predictable. You don't feel disrespected if you no longer expect respect in certain areas. But there's a trade-off. Each time I justified silence, I made it easier to remain silent the next time. Each time I accepted erasure, I lowered the threshold for what felt acceptable. The line kept moving, and the people around me didn't have to push it. They simply followed where I placed it. I wasn't being mistreated in obvious ways. No one yelled at me. No one undermined me openly. There were no villains here. Just a slow, quiet agreement between my behavior and their expectations. I had become dependable in a way that required diminishing myself. And the most unsettling realization of all, no one had asked me to do that. I had volunteered. Roles don't arrive with announcements. No one sits you down and says, "This is who you are now." They emerge quietly, through repetition, through what you accept, through what you correct, and what you don't. By the time I noticed the role I had been assigned, it was already well established. I was the stabilizer, not the decision maker, not the visionary, the stabilizer, the person you bring in when something needs to be held together long enough for someone else to take credit for moving it forward. When projects were pitched, I wasn't asked what I thought. I was asked whether I could support execution. When timelines slipped, I was consulted for feasibility. When tensions rose, I was instructed to keep things grounded. It sounded complimentary. It even felt like trust. But trust without influence is just responsibility without authority. I became the person others leaned on emotionally as well. Colleagues vented to me in private, then contradicted me in public. They borrowed my clarity, then spoke with my confidence while I stayed quiet. I noticed how my calmness was used as a contrast. "He's different," someone once said. "He doesn't need recognition." That sentence wasn't an observation. It was permission. Permission to move past me. Permission to assume my consent. Permission to rely on my silence. And I let it happen because it aligned with an identity I had quietly accepted. The reasonable one, the adult in the room. The person who doesn't make things awkward. What I didn't realize was that this role came with an unspoken ceiling. People like me don't disrupt. People like me don't demand. People like me don't suddenly step forward. We are expected to stay consistent. The moment you deviate, you're no longer easy. You become confused, unpredictable, inconvenient. So I stayed where I was placed. I noticed how new hires were introduced, who was described as strategic, who was labeled promising, who was given space to fail publicly and recover. I was none of those things. I was solid. There's a quiet grief that comes with realizing you've been cast in a supporting role in your own professional life. Not because you lack depth, but because you've been too careful with it. And yet, I didn't feel trapped. I felt still. Still enough to observe. Still enough to understand the structure. Still enough to see how decisions were made. And more importantly, who made them. I had access. I had information. I had trust. What I didn't have yet was intention, but that was changing. The day things changed didn't look important. There was no argument, no meeting, no dramatic moment where someone finally crossed a line. It was an ordinary day, shaped like dozens of others before it. That's why it mattered. I arrived early, as usual. The office was quiet in that hollow way it gets before the noise arrives. I made coffee. I sat at my desk. I opened my notebook, not my laptop, and reviewed notes from the previous week. Not tasks, not deadlines, patterns. Who spoke first in meetings? Who summarized decisions? Whose objections were treated as friction and whose were framed as insight? Which risks were ignored until they became urgent, and who was asked to fix them afterward. I had been collecting these observations without realizing what I was preparing for. That morning, something in me slowed down. Not exhaustion, not resentment, clarity. I noticed how automatic my responses had become, how quickly I said yes, how rarely I asked why, how instinctively I stepped in when something wobbled before anyone even requested it. I realized I had been preemptively protecting systems that had never protected me. There was no anger in that realization, just a quiet recalibration. Later that day, in a meeting I'd attended many times before, someone proposed a timeline I knew was unrealistic. Everyone nodded. The energy pushed forward. I felt the familiar impulse rise, the one that told me to speak up, to soften the risk, to offer a workaround. I didn't. I sat still. I watched. I let the moment pass. No one noticed my silence. The meeting ended on schedule. People moved on, and for the first time, I didn't feel anxious about what might break. I felt detached. That was the shift. I understood then that silence didn't have to mean endurance. It could mean choice. That I didn't owe constant correction to people who weren't listening in the first place. That evening, I walked home instead of taking the bus. The city felt different when I wasn't rehearsing conversations in my head. I wasn't planning how to smooth things over the next day. I wasn't preparing to compensate. I was simply present. I didn't decide anything that day. No plan was formed. No line was drawn. But something fundamental changed. I stopped offering myself automatically. And in that pause, space appeared. After that day, nothing outwardly changed. That's important. I didn't withdraw. I didn't become cold or passive-aggressive. I still showed up. I still did my work. I still met deadlines and answered questions when asked. But something subtle had shifted in how I used my voice. Before, silence had been reactive, a way to avoid friction, a habit formed by years of deciding it wasn't worth the cost to speak. Now, silence became deliberate, selective. I began noticing the difference between being invited to contribute and being expected to compensate. When a problem surfaced, I waited to see if it was actually mine to solve, or if I had simply been trained to step in. Often no one asked. They had just assumed I would. In meetings, I spoke less, but when I did, I spoke with precision. No cushioning, no over-explaining. I stopped rescuing half-formed ideas by finishing other people's sentences. I let pauses sit longer than I felt comfortable. People mistook that pause for hesitation. That was fine. I watched how quickly silence made others uneasy, how they filled it with certainty, how decisions hardened in the absence of challenge. And I noted, not with judgment, but with interest, who benefited from that. I also stopped volunteering for just one more thing. Not dramatically, just quietly. When requests came without clarity or authority, I asked neutral questions. What's the priority here? Who owns the outcome? How does this fit with the timeline we agreed on? Not confrontational, not defensive, just present. The reactions were subtle, but telling. Some people adjusted. Others grew impatient. A few seemed almost confused, like a machine had stopped behaving the way it was designed to. I wasn't refusing, I was choosing, and choice changes how people see you, not immediately, but gradually. I noticed emails that used to assume my availability now ask for it. Meetings where my opinion had once been summarized by others now paused, waiting. Still, most people interpreted my quietness the same way they always had. They thought I was retreating. They thought I had lost interest. They thought I was disengaging. They thought silence meant I had nothing to add. They couldn't see what was happening underneath, that I was watching more carefully than ever, that I was documenting, not reacting, that I was finally separating my identity from my utility. Silence had stopped being something that happened to me. It had become something I used. What they never saw was how prepared I already was. Not because I had planned this arc in advance, but because quiet people tend to accumulate understanding the way others accumulate attention. Slowly, methodically, without display, I had been inside the system long enough to know where the real livers were. Not the ones announced in meetings, but the ones buried in processes, approvals, and dependencies. The invisible architecture that determined who could move quickly and who couldn't. Once silence became a choice, my attention sharpened. I started organizing what I already knew. Every meeting I attended, I wrote fewer notes, but clearer ones. Dates, decisions, names attached to outcomes, where accountability blurred, where responsibility was deferred. I stopped summarizing feelings and started recording facts, not to use against anyone, to understand the terrain. I noticed how often urgency was manufactured to bypass scrutiny, how frequently alignment was invoked only after decisions had already been made, how the same few voices framed risk as confidence, and everyone else adapted around them. In the evenings, I reviewed documents I had once skimmed, policies, escalation paths, performance frameworks, contractual obligations. The things no one reads carefully because they assume they'll never need to. I wasn't looking for loopholes. I was looking for clarity. I paid attention to how projects were funded, how approvals were justified retroactively, how credit flowed upward while liability flowed sideways. And I began mapping relationships, not socially, but structurally. Who deferred to whom? Who avoided certain conversations? Who spoke boldly only when insulated by hierarchy? What surprised me wasn't corruption or malice, it was fragility. So many systems relied on unspoken agreements, on people like me filling gaps without acknowledgement, on silence, smoothing over inconsistencies. I had been part of that smoothing. Now I stopped. I didn't disrupt. I didn't expose. I didn't warn. I simply documented. I also invested in myself quietly. I refreshed skills I had let stagnate because I'd been busy maintaining others' momentum. I updated the records, organized portfolios, clarified boundaries, internally first. No one noticed. They still saw the same calm presence, the same neutral tone, the same steady output. What they didn't see was the shift from participation to positioning, from reaction to readiness. I wasn't preparing to strike. I was preparing to stand somewhere else. And the most important thing, no one suspected a thing. The clarity didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly, in pieces, the way understanding usually does, when you're no longer rushing to explain yourself. One evening, while reviewing a set of internal documents I had worked on months earlier, I noticed something I had missed at the time, a minor discrepancy, not an error, more like an assumption that had never been verified. I followed it. That led me to another document, then another. Different teams, different timelines. The same pattern is repeating. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just a dependency no one had fully acknowledged. A critical process, one that several high-visibility initiatives quietly relied on, was stabilized almost entirely by informal knowledge. Knowledge that lived in people, not systems, in me. I sat back and felt something unfamiliar, not excitement, relief. Because clarity is calming when you've been confused for too long. I realized that much of what kept things running wasn't authority or strategy. It was continuity, memory, context, the quiet work of people who had been there long enough to see how decisions aged. And I also realized how precarious that was, not in a threatening way, just fragile. I didn't tell anyone what I'd noticed, not because I wanted leverage, but because I wanted to understand whether this knowledge would change how I was treated if it were known. Experience told me it wouldn't, so I kept it private. I began asking questions, not about the dependency itself, but around it. Who owned it on paper? Who was accountable if it failed? The answers were vague, circular, deferred. No one had a clear answer. That was the moment I understood something essential. I had been operating as a silent stabilizer in a system that mistook stability for permanence. They didn't see me because they didn't imagine my absence. And that absence didn't have to be dramatic to be felt. I didn't feel powerful. I felt free. Free from the belief that I needed to prove my value. Free from the fear that silence meant invisibility. Free from the urgency to correct people who weren't listening. For the first time, I knew where I stood, and more importantly, I knew where I didn't. Knowing something and deciding something are very different experiences. For weeks, I did nothing with what I knew, not because I was unsure, but because I understood the weight of choice. Once made, some decisions can't be quietly reversed. They don't explode, they simply redirect everything that follows. I considered my options carefully. I could speak up, present the dependency, offer to formalize it, ask politely for recognition or authority to match responsibility. That path was familiar, safe, predictable. I could continue as I was, remain the stabilizer, accept the role I had perfected, let the system keep running smoothly with my quiet participation. Or I could step aside, not abruptly, not emotionally, just deliberately, not as punishment, as alignment. That was the irreversible option. Because once you stop protecting a system from its own blind spots, it has to see itself. I asked myself hard questions, not about loyalty, but about honesty. Was I staying because I believed in the work, or because I feared disruption? Was my silence serving the organization, or preserving my own discomfort with change? Was I being patient, or postponing myself indefinitely? The answers didn't arrive with certainty. They arrived with calm. I realized I wasn't angry at anyone. I didn't need validation or an apology. What I needed was coherence between how I was treated and how I showed up. So I made a decision that didn't require confrontation. I would stop being the invisible hinge. Everything quietly turned on. I would honor my responsibilities, clearly defined ones. I would meet expectations, explicit ones. I would no longer fill gaps that existed only because I had always been willing to. That was it. No announcement, no ultimatum, no emotional closure, just a private line drawn, and once drawn, it couldn't be unseen. The decision didn't change my behavior overnight. It refined it. I continued to do my job, precisely as defined. Not expansively, not defensively, just accurately. I followed the processes as written, escalated when guidelines required it, deferred decisions that were never formally mine to make. This wasn't withdrawal, it was alignment. When issues surfaced that I had once resolved quietly, I documented them instead. When timelines slipped, I referenced prior agreements rather than absorbing the delay. When ambiguity appeared, I asked for clarification in writing. Nothing confrontational, just visible. I noticed how often people relied on my judgment without granting me authority. Now, that reliance had to be named, or it didn't move forward. Meetings began to slow, not because I caused friction, but because I stopped smoothing it away. Questions lingered longer. Assumptions were challenged, not by me, but by reality. Decisions that once glided on unspoken understanding now required confirmation. People didn't connect this shift to me. They connected it to process, to complexity, to unexpected friction. I remained calm, present, neutral. I didn't correct their interpretation. Behind the scenes, I took care of things I had postponed for years. I updated my records, reviewed contracts, reassessed finances, cleaned my professional slate. Not to leave, to choose. I consulted no one at work. I didn't seek allies or reassurance. This wasn't a movement, it was a recentering. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the system began to feel the absence of something it had never formally acknowledged. At first, the consequences didn't look like consequences. They looked like an inconvenience. A project review ran longer than expected. A decision was stalled because someone wasn't sure who owned the final call. A client question lingered in an inbox for a day longer than usual. Small things, easily dismissed. But systems don't collapse all at once. They reveal themselves through delays, through uncertainty, through the quiet discomfort of not knowing who will step in next. People began double-checking things that had once just worked. Meetings ended without conclusions. Follow-ups multiplied. I noticed people hesitating, pausing in ways they never had before. Do we know if this is okay? Has anyone confirmed this? Who usually handles this part? They were asking the right questions. They just weren't asking them out loud yet. What changed wasn't productivity. It was confidence, the kind that comes from assuming someone else has already thought things through. That assumption was gone. I continued working as before, calm, precise, responsive, within scope. I didn't rush to reassure. I didn't fill the silences. I let uncertainty surface naturally, not to expose anyone, but because uncertainty had always been there. It had just been buffered. Some colleagues grew frustrated, not with me, but with the process. Others tried to compensate, stepping into roles they weren't familiar with. A few began documenting things for the first time, realizing how much knowledge had been informal. No one blamed me. There was nothing to blame. I hadn't changed who I was. I had simply stopped being invisible glue. And glue, when it dries, reveals the cracks it once concealed. The moment people realized something was wrong didn't arrive with panic. It arrived with confusion. A review uncovered inconsistencies that no one could fully explain. A dependency surfaced without a clear owner. Questions that should have been answered easily required meetings. then more meetings. What had once felt intuitive now required effort. People began reaching out, not directly to fix things, but to understand them. Conversations circled the same points. Emails grew longer, language became cautious. I was included more frequently, but differently, not as the quiet stabilizer, as a reference. Do you remember how this usually works? Wasn't there a way we handled this before? You've been around. Does this look right to you? I answered honestly. I'm not sure who owns that. That wasn't formally defined. I can share what I've seen, but I don't make that call. The words landed heavier than I expected, not because they were sharp, but because they were accurate. I could feel the discomfort in the pauses that followed, the subtle recalibration, people realizing that knowledge and responsibility had never been the same thing and that they had relied on that imbalance. Attempts were made to streamline, to retroactively assign ownership, to recreate clarity that had once been embodied, not documented. But it was too late to recreate it casually, because once you see the gap, you can't unsee it. And once someone stops filling it automatically, it becomes visible to everyone. No one accused me of anything. No one demanded explanations. There was nothing to confront, just a growing awareness that the system had been leaning on something it never officially supported. And now it had to learn how to stand without it. The conversation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointing in its calm. No raised voices, no accusations, just a meeting request. Short, neutral, carefully worded. I sat across from my manager in a small room with a glass wall. The city moved outside. Indifferent, they spoke first. We've noticed some friction lately, they said. Things aren't moving as smoothly as before. I nodded, not in agreement, in acknowledgement. There was a pause, as if they were waiting for me to fill it. I didn't. Finally, they asked, "Is there something we should be aware of?" I chose my words carefully, not to protect myself, but to stay truthful. I've been working within my defined role, I said. If there are expectations beyond that, I'm open to clarifying them. That was it. No defense, no history lesson, no emotional framing. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was revealing. They leaned back, looked at their notes, then at me. "We've relied on you a lot," they said. "Probably more than we realized." I let that sit. Recognition, when it arrives late, doesn't feel triumphant. It feels quiet, almost fragile and how. "I value clarity," I replied, "for everyone involved." There was a nod, a mutual understanding without resolution. No promises were made, no roles redefined. But something shifted. For the first time, the space between expectation and authority had been named, without tension, and naming something changes how it can be used. After that conversation, nothing transformed overnight. There was no sudden promotion, no public acknowledgement, no narrative arc, where everything is neatly resolved. What changed was quieter. I stopped defining myself by how much I could absorb. For years, my identity had been built around reliability, being the person who could be counted on to adapt, to stabilize, to carry weight without complaint. That version of me wasn't false, but it was incomplete. Now, I understand myself differently. I was still calm, still thoughtful, still capable, but I was no longer available by default. I noticed how people interacted with me after that. Some were more deliberate. Some are more cautious. A few seemed unsure of where I fit now that I wasn't automatically compensating. That uncertainty didn't bother me, because for the first time, I wasn't trying to fit a shape someone else had drawn. I became clearer, not louder, more defined, not harder. When I spoke, it was with intention. When I stayed silent, it was because I chose to listen, not because I was shrinking. I measured my energy differently. I respected my time the way I had once respected everyone else's. And something unexpected happened. I felt lighter, not because the system had changed, but because I no longer needed to be seen as indispensable. I only needed to be aligned with my values, my limits, my sense of self. I hadn't burned bridges. I hadn't exposed anyone. I hadn't demanded recognition. I had simply stepped into authorship of my own presence. And that was enough. If there's a lesson in this story, it isn't about strategy. It's about awareness. Most people who are quietly relied upon are not weak. They're stable. And stability, when left unnamed, gets taken for granted. Systems don't exploit that intentionally. They simply adapt to it until the person holding everything together realizes they were never meant to disappear into the structure. I didn't win anything in a dramatic sense. I didn't reclaim a title or expose a flaw. I didn't reverse the past. What I reclaimed was authorship. I learned that silence isn't the problem. Unchosen silence is. That being calm doesn't mean being available. That dignity doesn't require confrontation. It requires clarity. You don't have to announce your boundaries for them to exist. You don't have to raise your voice for your presence to matter. And you don't owe endless compensation to systems that benefit from your restraint without acknowledging it. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stop holding up what was never yours to carry alone. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been described as reliable when you were quietly eroding, I want to hear from you. Have you ever stepped back and realized how much of yourself you were giving simply because no one ever told you to stop? Tell me in the comments.